So in order to detect when somebody is doing something nasty to your DNS infrastructure, you need to do some kind of monitoring. And this is typically what you do, and we go into a lot more detail in the network security monitoring class. You can store log data, which your various servers do anyway. You can adjust them to keep various kinds of logs of what they're doing. You can store network flows, which is what Cisco started with NetFlow, which is the kind of information ISPs like to use, which is just who's been making a connection to who and how many bytes did they send over that connection, so I can do things like throttle bandwidth and balance traffic and such. And then there's packet data, of course. You could save all the packets of all the data going through, which is a lot of data and really kind of hard to analyze, but then you have the whole story about everything. And then there's application level metadata, which is showing you just the high level transmissions without any of the addresses in it, which might help diagnose certain things. And one advantage of that is it's anonymous. So you're not leaking your users' IP addresses. Although, as AOL found out years ago, even application level data can compromise people's privacy. AOL had something like 1 million queries that people had done to a search engine, and they gave it out to the world for research purposes, and people rapidly found out that they could figure out who people were and all kinds of private things about them from their searches. Because people search for medical treatment for diseases they have, they search for their own name, they search for their own address and all that jazz, so pretty soon it's not as anonymous as you think it is. Anyway, so log data is things you might have, queries that have problems like format errors. Lame delegations are when one DNS response tells you to go ask another DNS server, but you can't get to the other DNS server, so it fails. Queries for names that don't exist, these various things that might be logged, you can control these. In named.conf, and you've got a project where you do this, you turn on a bunch of these logs. It's all just the various configuration lines here. So channel tells it where to send the logs. You can send it to a file, you can send it to standard error, you can throw it away by sending it to null, or you can send it to syslog, which is just where the generic system log on Linux, and you can have different versions of it. You can set it to make a group of files and roll over, so it'll have maybe 10 files and then overwrite the oldest one with the newest data, so it uses a certain amount of room on the disk. You can decide how severe the events you log are, maybe only critical events, maybe you want to have informational events logged so you have more information, but you're going to be able to store less log files in the same space. And you can control what's printed out in the messages. You could log every query. It's going to make a lot of log data, but then when you go to what we're going to do in the second half, where we're looking for specific kinds of evil attacks on DNS, it'll be useful. So plus would indicate a recursive query here, and S indicates a signed query, and E indicates extended DNS if you have that, which remember is the protocol that lets you send DNS replies up to 4096 bytes over UDP instead of the original 512 bytes. Then you've got security. This shows you things that were failed, things that hit security boundaries like access control lists, like somebody tried to do a zone transfer but they're not in the approved IP range, and other things like that. So you can set access control lists where only certain people are allowed to query, only certain people are allowed recursive queries, only certain people can transfer, and then when people try to do these things and are denied, you typically log that event just like you log failed login events, because that's often a very clear example of an attack. Somebody's trying to do something that they're not allowed to do. Update security shows you that updating the DNS zone data failed. This is information that try to update your machine like it's a slave server, tell it more new information about the zone, and this again failed because someone that's not allowed to is trying to send updates to the zone. All right. And DNS Sec, you've got a variety of DNS Sec Log Messages. If you deploy DNS Sec and try to enforce it, then there are various things that can go wrong. So you can enable it, and then you can enable validation, which means it will not accept improperly signed things. And then you'll see records. So here's DNS key starting, attempting a validation, and so on. A record of the activities that took place to collect DNS Sec information and verify it. X for in and X for out are zone transfers. So you can log an X for out. That means somebody successfully made a copy of all your data with a zone transfer. And an X for in would mean somebody moved in data with a zone transfer. And both of those things should only be allowed for people you trust. And if somebody else is doing that, that would be a bad thing. Then you can record all the packets. Just have a span port on your network. If you have a span port configured on a switch, it will make an extra copy of every packet going out that port just so you can record it. You can then put it into TCP dump or Wireshark, although Wireshark, both these tools are not very good for this purpose. There's better tools like dump cap. But anyway, you record these packets, and then you can also use a splitter or a hub, or you can send it to a server that stores all the packets like we're doing in the monitoring class, sending it to something like Security Onion. And that's the game. You store it in some PCAP format, and then you have a big file. I think that was kind of fun in that class. They talked about how if you wanted to log a month of data on a network that had an average of 100 megabits per second, that is 41 terabytes of data per month. So that's the problem with this stuff. You have a lot of data, probably far more data than you really want to answer any reasonable question. All right, network flow is what ISPs keep, and this seems to me very obviously imitating the red pen registers of telephone calls. The old telephone network, basically before computers, back when there were just Bakelite switches rotating to make the calls, kept track of who called who for long distance and how long the call was so they could bill you. And they called that the pen register. This number called that number at this time for that many minutes. That's all it is, and that's essentially all flow data is. And I think it's for exactly the same purpose, so your ISP can charge you for how much you're using. So that's the point. It'll try to figure out when you connect to somebody and then send data up and send data back. It'll try to boil that down to just one record. You connected to this machine, you sent this much data at this time. So they call that a flow, and on it goes. NetFlow developed it for this, and the flow typically goes only in one direction. So if you send data up to a server like a request, and you get a response like downloading a file, that will be two files, two flows. One flow going up with just little data, and one flow coming down with a lot more data. And that became such a hit after Cisco did it that the Internet Engineering Task Force gave it an official name and made it a standard protocol called IPFix, which is the official standard for doing this kind of records. Now, if you have a TCP session, unless something goes wrong, like an interruption partway through a download, it actually is very clear where it starts and where it ends. There's a handshake to start the session, and then at the end there's something like a fin or a reset, and in between there's just a bunch of packets going and then an acknowledgement. So it's very clear what's one flow for TCP. For UDP, it's not that clear at all. Because UDP, you send a query and you may or may not get a response, and if you get a response, it's not connected in any obvious way to the query. So, if you do have some kind of exchange over UDP, NetFlow may be confused and see it as several separate conversations because they just have to sort of guess when there's a pause in time, that must mean the end of this one or something indirect like that. So here's what flow records look like. They'll show you the name of the router, source IP, destination IP, number of packets transferred, bytes transferred, and the time. These are timestamps in Unix. They look like this. This is the way they really look in Excel too. If you turn off the formatting, they just count the number of seconds since some starting time. I think with Unix it's January 1, 1970. With Excel it's January 1, 1930 or something like that. But anyway, it's just this number is how the time is really stored in computers. And that's the game. And then I think you got source and destination port and a little bit of information about the flags and such. But that's it. That one line of just a few things would represent a whole conversation, like downloading something from a server. So if somebody is connecting to a server and downloading malware, you would see a flow connecting to perhaps a known malicious server, but you don't even get the name of the file. You can't get a copy of the file and run it to see what it is. This is very limited information. But on the other hand, this means you can quickly search through all the records for a month and find something, whereas if you try to search through all the PCAPs for a month, it's a huge job. All right, and then you got application level metadata, which is what Wireshark gives you when you right-click something and say follow TCP stream or follow UDP stream. Throw away all the addresses and just show me what appeared on the screen, what I typed, what the response was. So we'll just show you the layer 7. So for DNS responses, it would tell you something like the domain, the result, the time, and the number of responses. So this domain was resolved to this many times. That's layer 7 data. And again, it makes it very easy to answer questions like how many people have been going to this place and which of my machines have been going to this place because it's something nasty like a command and control server. This would be a good place to go for that. Although this one doesn't even show the source of the request. So you'd want a little more than this. Anyway, let's try some Cahoots. 5 questions. All right, what's the data that uses the IPFIX standard? All right, that's it. The network flows like NetFlow from Cisco. All right. What data is controlled by named.conf? All right, that's the logs. That's where you adjust them. All right. What data do you get at a span port? All right, those are the packets. Good. All right.
Randomization problem again.
It's not random? Oh, well, I think it is. It's just we only have 3 samples.
Oh, yeah.
They've all been the third one?
Yeah.
Okay, well.
The second one.
Well, we'll see. So what log entry tells you that someone collected your bind data with a zone transfer? All right, that's transfer out is good. Yeah, so I think there is some randomness. It's not always the same. Anyway, all right, so what data protects the privacy of your users by excluding IP addresses? I'm missing a C there. Okay, that's application level metadata, good. All right. So I will get the top 3. All right, so now we'll talk about how you detect attacks. Cache poisoning, which we talked about, the Kaminsky attack, where you send many replies. Let me turn this around here. All right. So what happens is the attacker makes a request for a record that is not already in the cache, and then they try to answer their own question by blasting it with many, many responses, hoping to get the right mixture of transaction ID and source port. And if they do that, they will succeed in tricking the server into storing the wrong value. So what really matters are these replies. The request hardly matters. It's a flood of replies, all from the same address. That would give you a clue. So you look for flows, for example, with destination or source port 53. And here you might see a cache poisoning attack, because here you have one message going to 53, and then a whole bunch of messages coming from 53 going to the same place very quickly, all from the same IP address to the server. So it's this is what you have. First, they're all going to the server. First you send one request, then you send many replies, all from the same place. And it doesn't make any sense for a customer to be asking for replies and then providing replies. This pattern alone suggests that something crazy is happening. If this guy is either a client or a server, why are they sending replies to my server and sending requests to my server? All right, so here you have no layer 7 data at flow records. You cannot actually see the request, so you do not know what domain name they're asking for. So it might be something as innocent as like this college, where a class ends and everybody runs to the lab and they all start opening websites and email in the lab, and they all come out one port, so they all seem to come from the same IP address. It could be that many requests would come from one location quickly. So that's an issue. All right, so you have to select the relevant data. In this case, the requests are irrelevant. The only thing we really care about are the replies. We need the source and destination IP. We'd like the domain name. We'd like to see the additional sections, because if you remember the details of the Kaminsky attack, the way you really make it powerful is you don't just answer the question with a lie, but you put the answer in the extra sections, because you're allowed to send extra information in those sections, and servers believe that extra information. So here's other things you might want to have. like the transaction ID and the timestamp, so you can see that they're just walking through all the transaction IDs trying to guess the right one. All right. Another issue is transient domains. These are domains that keep moving. You know, normally if you have a domain name like ccsf.edu, it sits on a server and it probably sits on the same server for years. Then you move to another server, you move it and sits on that server for years. That's the normal pattern of change. But criminals can only use a server for maybe a few hours or a day before they get caught, and somebody cleans up that server or disconnects it because they're doing something awful like sending out spam email. So they have to keep hopping to a new server. And if they've written malware that's infected a bunch of machines that has a hard-coded domain name, then they have to keep moving the IP address to a new server. And you'll see that here. That's a transient domain. So it'll just keep changing. And one clue is it won't even be owned by the same autonomous system. Most people, if they move from one server to another, they do it within the same company. Like you don't, for example, you might just upgrade from one server to a bigger server at the same company, but moving to another company is strange, and you certainly wouldn't keep moving to a new company every few hours. That would be nuts. So that's what you'll see for command and control centers, places where they're dropping stolen files and things like that, people that are doing something bad. OpenDNS has, I think they're the ones with the Umbrella project now, they got bought by Cisco, and they are really doing a lot of this. They have so much DNS traffic, they can see global patterns, and they are developing a whole series of rules to notice when the patterns of DNS activity identify a site as a bad actor, and then they put it in a blacklist, and they won't let any of their customers go there. So they protect you like another layer of firewall or antivirus above your company. That's why they call it an umbrella. They detect evil without anyone complaining it or reporting it, and save you from it, because they can see from where they are the pattern of DNS that indicates a bad site. Yeah.
In this case, do they use multiple registries or?
Yes, typically multiple registries. Well, let me think about that. They often are. One of the common techniques is domain name kiting. Until recently, you could sign up for a domain name and use it for like 3 days before you had to pay. Mm-hmm. So a bunch of them were like those trial accounts.
Oh, okay.
And they might keep using the same host or a different one all the time. Now I'm not quite sure the most modern technique they're doing for this. All right. So, and of course, even this could be some kind of bug or a security research site. This is something that happened to Microsoft. Microsoft found a bunch of command and control centers in the early years of doing this research, and they would take them down, and then it would turn out that they were taking down researcher sites who had already defeated the bot and taken over the botnet and put up a research machine to control it. And this, in fact, in the world of stopping bots and stopping spam, there are many groups doing it, and they often hate each other with an incredible passion. Like Spam House is one of the groups with a huge blacklist, and there's other similar ones, and people subscribe to these services, and they are bitterly at war with each other, accusing each other of being criminals, of lying, of stealing things. It's really, the good guys are not united here at all. They're very much divided against themselves. Anyway, then there's transient domains. Remember, every domain, when you answer a record, you give it some information like an IP address, and you give it a TTL, which is how long to cache this record. And a typical cache is like a few hours or a day. Don't bother asking me again about this one for a day, because I don't move it that often. So if you get a really small TTL, that means either you got it from a cache and the cache was just about to expire, or it's actually being served up with a small TTL, like 60 seconds, which is very short. The reason you don't want to do that is if you set your TTL to 60 seconds, people will keep on coming back to your authoritative server essentially all the time. So your authoritative server has to have enough capacity to handle all the requests from everybody in the world going to your site. If you make that cache longer, like a day, they'll only have to ask you once per day where your servers are. So this would be a clue that these people are trying to move these domains quickly. All right, there's another one called round robin DNS, and we saw this before, we were doing it live. When you do a query to something like OpenDNS or Google's 8.8.8.8, it's actually a cluster of servers. So as you query it, you'll see different answers, 4 servers are up there. So let's see if it still works to do it to Microsoft.com, because Microsoft.com was a cluster when I tried it a couple years ago. Let's see if it still is. Dig a Microsoft.com. All right, yeah, that looks pretty good. So Microsoft has 5 numbers, 23, 191, 104, and another 23. And if I just do it again, let's see, there's a way to make it shorter. Plus short, I think. Yeah. All right. Well, it looks to me like I'm getting the same answer every time. No, I'm not getting the same answer every time. This one's 197. Now it's, is it the same every time?
Same one.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. I don't know what they've done there that makes it different. Let me see what it used to look like when I made my slides. Yeah, it used to look like this. You could watch them rotate. First 104 is on top, then 191 is on top, then 104 is on top. This is actually quite common, that you have several servers handing it out and you put them out in different orders. So all the people making requests, some will go here and some will go there. Now this is one way to do it. Another way to do it, which it looks like Microsoft might have upgraded to, is to have a hardware load balancer. So they all come to one address and then you sort them out at the other end, sending some here and some there. Anyway, so that's something you will see, and that does not indicate anything wrong if you see this. If it's the same set of 5 numbers but the order changes, that's a common thing that a normal legitimate site would do. That doesn't mean they're bad guys trying to hide. That just means they're good guys with multiple servers to handle the load. All right, then there's fast pluxing domains where the TTL is just a few seconds and it changes really fast. And the point of this is to make it very hard to stop botnets. If you find out their command and control center and block it, they've already moved somewhere else. So configure does this. So the highest number you'll ever see is 60. When you query configure domains, you get 3, then you get 3, it goes down to 32. If you do it again in 30 seconds, next time it's 4, then it's back up at 32. You'll never see any number bigger than 60 because 60 is the duration of these records because they want them to change very quickly. So you can detect these things by just getting data for domain, IP, last activity, and so on. And here you'll see the same domain name resolving to many different addresses quickly. And that's a clue. That is very strange behavior. All right. Then there's phantom domains, where you register a domain, use the domain name for only a few days, and then throw it away and now get a new domain name. Like we were talking about before, you might be working on trials. The point of this is to, your malware will now have to have a domain name generator that can create all those names. This way you can have like 100 new domains created every day by your malware, only one of them you actually use, and the good guys trying to stop you would have to buy all 100 and stop them. Because sinkholing is a common technique. If you can discover the domain name of the command and control center server, you buy that name and host it, point it to a server that is not a command and control center or a fake one, and then you take over the botnet. The botnet calls home, it connects to you, and you now rule the botnet. That's what researchers do a lot. So to prevent that, they make one that keeps calling different domain names, and Configure did that too, I think. I think at one point it had 10,000 new domains a day, and Microsoft made a special deal with ISPs to buy all those domains as fast as they could be predicted and actually get ahead of it. Anyway, so you can find domains that have been active recently, find their current address, and find one with no matching historical records. These are domains that have just appeared out of nowhere, and then they close quickly, and that's clearly not normal, because somebody would normally buy a domain, put up a website, and it would be there for a while. All right, and find ones with very different IP addresses for the same domain. So this happened with WannaCry. WannaCry was one of the most recent examples of sinkholing. WannaCry infected all the hospitals in Britain, or a lot of hospitals in Britain, and messed them up so that there was actually patients that failed to get medical treatment that needed it. And this actually used the stuff the Russians stole from the NSA and leaked out. And Marcus Hutchins stopped it. We talked about this in the very first day. Marcus Hutchins accidentally stopped it. He was analyzing the malware, and for dynamic analysis, one of the easiest things to do is just run it and look at the network traffic, and he saw that it was trying to go to that domain, and that domain was not purchased. So he just bought it, and immediately the malware quit working. That was the off switch, was to just buy that domain. So he accidentally turned it off, and that saved the American hospitals from that attack. So it was pretty cool. And here's the configure list. I thought I had this. Configure had some kind of random number generator, deterministic, pseudo-random thing, that would create this long list of domains. And in order to take over the domain, you had to buy all of these for days ahead. And Microsoft did that. They bought tens of thousands of these domain names so that it was actually calling Microsoft servers all the time instead of calling the real bad guys. 50,000 new domains a day, that's right. All right. Here's another one we talked about before. I think you can corrupt a machine with malware and change its local DNS server So instead of going to your company, your ISP's DNS server or some public server like 8.8.8.8, it goes to some criminal server where they can just tell you any lies they want to forever, and you will never know. So they can tell you the truth about most of your browsing and just lie about your bank and send it to a fake bank site, something like that. And this led to quite a political problem in the United States because the FBI busted the criminals, seized their server, and then they didn't want to turn it off, because if they did, all those machines would go off the internet because they were trying to use it for the domain name server. So they continued to run legitimate DNS servers at that address for about 2 years. And this became very difficult because it was hard. This was no longer a legitimate law enforcement activity, and they had a hard time finding out who was going to pay for that. But anyway, they did run it for about 2 years while they tried to have news articles and public service announcements to try to tell people, check your DNS settings and set them back. And they managed to make it so, and only an acceptable number of people lost service when they turned it off. Anyway, so you can detect these things if you get recursive DNS requests to suspicious remote entries. I mean, if anybody is sending recursive queries, if you're most companies, you'd probably be wise to force them to use your official DNS provider. Using external ones is probably pretty bad practice anyway, because you'd probably like to filter where they go and you'd probably like to log where they go. But if you do let them use services like OpenDNS and 8.8.8.8, then you should know what those are and see if somebody's going to something that is not the right official one and it's not a known public one. You know, well, why would anybody use this? Why would anybody be sending DNS queries to some screwy server? That would be a thing to know. And that's the kind of thing that OpenDNS can protect you from. All right. And of course, another clue is if the server is actually very far away, it would be mighty strange to use it. All right, then there's tunneling. You can have DNS traffic that is not about DNS resolution at all. It is about sneaking stolen data out of your network and defeating your data loss prevention systems. So they will take something like stolen passwords or usernames and encrypt it and put it in long, random appearing domain names. For DNS resolvers, for fake DNS servers, that's a way for the data to travel out of your network. So you'll see anything long, DNS sec keys or long-looking URLs will have this. And one clue is you'll have very large request packets. Normal request is very short. I just want to know the A record for google.com. But if you make that name really long, then it's bigger. And so you'll see most packets are below 100 bytes. Then you'll have a few up here in 500 and 600, right up near the maximum. And that'll tell you those are probably tunnels leaking data out. That's what's called a covert channel, when you have some way to send data out of a network and nobody even knows you're sending data. It looks like innocent traffic doing something else. Then, of course, there's denial of service attacks, just trying to turn off your DNS server. You often have spoofed source addresses because DNS typically runs over UDP, so you don't actually need a botnet. You can just put random source addresses in the packet and you don't care. They'll still hit the server and the server will still generate a response and use up CPU and bandwidth. So you can attack it in that regard. You don't really need a botnet. So here's things you can do to detect these. If you have an imbalance between incoming and outgoing bits per sec, that would be a clue. You're getting a lot of requests and people are actually not even caring about the replies. An unusual number of requests per second or so on. This is the basic point here. If you want to stop any kind of denial of service attack, what you must do is find some kind of pattern in the attack packets that makes it possible to tell them from legitimate network traffic. And I know the big one that was all the rage about 3 years ago in America was the Al-Qassam cyber army. Somebody put a video on YouTube insulting Mohammed, so a group of people in Islamic nations decided to punish America for that, and they calculated how many dollars they regarded the insult as worth, and they took down American banks for a carefully calculated amount of time to add up to that many dollars to punish us for every day that video was on YouTube. And they had about 12 generations of attack, and at the beginning they would just send packets that were all full of capital A's. It was very primitive, so it was very easy to block. But every generation after that, they would improve the attack to make it harder to spot. And for a while I'd go to the security conventions and they would have secret talks that you couldn't record where they would tell you what the signatures were for this month's attacks. And they would try to prevent everybody from finding out so the people attacking wouldn't find out how we were blocking them. And that's the game here. You look through the packets and try to somehow discriminate them from legitimate traffic. If they all come from one IP address, it's easy. If they all have some characteristic pattern of bytes, it's easy. But the smarter attackers make it look more and more like good traffic, and make you work harder to block it. All right. So I'll do this one, and then I want to say a little bit about this interesting article that came out this week. So, 5 questions. Okay, what packets are used to perform DNS poisoning? All right. The replies are what poisons the server. The request isn't important, it's the replies where you trick it into believing a lie that you tell it instead of a legitimate reply. All right, so I dig evil.com and I get 4 IPs and they're in a different order every time. What does that indicate? Normal behavior, that's a common form of load balancing. You have 4 servers and you put them up in a different order every time. Doesn't mean anything bad is happening. All right. If I always find a TTL value below 61, what does that indicate? All right, that's fast flux. That's someone that wants to keep moving the server very quickly to make it hard to block. All right, what process creates a covert channel? All right, that's tunneling, good. Tunneling in general refers to putting some kind of data in a different packet than the expected packet. All right, what did Marcus Hutchins do? All right, that's called sinkholing. You buy somebody else's domain and you put something other than what they expected there. So their traffic is stolen and sent somewhere else. Typically just thrown away, but it could just go to a server that doesn't do what the bad guys want it to do. So, all right. Let me record this AE. So you always see strange traffic on your network, and some people are motivated to figure it out and other people aren't. So here was his observation. You have MX lookup failures. Now, if you do a dig for MX, you find mail exchangers, which are the people that are supposed to handle email to that domain. And he would find certain domains get an incorrect response, and that fouls up their ability to send email or receive email. So here's what he got. He went to a public resolver, and he got an answer from RIPE. Here's an answer for Twitter that is a private address, which is kind of nuts. Here you go to twitter.com and you get a defective answer that doesn't even contain the answer. You get a deformed answer. So you said, why in the world is a huge company like Twitter handing out wrong answers for DNS and broken answers for DNS? That's an interesting question. So you can look at the time delta, and here's sometimes very fast and sometimes very slow. So here's a real query of ripe.p of something, he's looking at PCAP. So here's one request that took 138 milliseconds, which, as you may know if you've done your trace routes, 100 milliseconds is enough time to go over an ocean and back. But here you have only 28 milliseconds. I've actually diagnosed network problems like this before by looking at the delay. There was a student that thought someone had hacked into their network, and the replies were all coming back within 1 millisecond. So I said, that object is in your house. And it turned out that they had done powerline networking and then bought the same brand of powerline networking for a tenant. They rented a room, and their traffic was going through the tenant's room instead of this person's room. But if you see something come back in 1 millisecond, it's in the room, in the building. If it's this short, it's really not far away. This is the kind of TTL you'll see if it's really traveling, to another city or another country. All right. Anyway, so he wrote DNS Ping. He wrote a simple Python script that will go on the internet and use DNS queries and then tell you how many reply and how much time it's taking for them to come back. So if you're going to a real server someplace in Europe, it will really take 200 milliseconds to go there and come back, and that's normal. And so, if you do ICMP and DNS pings and you get different answers, that means somebody is lying to you. So here he is pinging somebody, and it takes 124 milliseconds, but when he does a DNS resolution, it only takes 12 milliseconds. This is actually really important, and this came up with EFF. This means somebody in the middle is intercepting your DNS requests and answering them before they get to the real server. This is the man-in-the-middle attack, and there are a bunch of people that do this. There was a big analysis of this about 4 years ago from China. The Great Firewall of China does this. It lies to you about DNS responses, and unfortunately some of those are then echoed out of the country. So some traffic outside China is actually fouled up by the Great Firewall of China, sending false DNS replies. Anyway, so that's the anomaly. Different domain names are treated differently. Only some of them do this. So somewhere there's a rogue name server impersonating 8.8.8.8 and responding to some, and it's closer to him. So he wonders, can he find it? All right. So he made this tool, DNS trace route, and so here's real versus rogue servers. If he goes to ripe.net, it's a real server. It's 13 hops away, 14 hops to get to Google, 185 milliseconds. But if he does it for twitter.com, it's only 9 hops away in 20 milliseconds, supposedly going from the same source address to the same destination address. So somebody is lying to you here. All right. So the rogue name server was handling broken MX responses, and what you're finding, this is like, you may have seen like this classical scene in the movies where somebody's talking on the phone and they hear a funny click and they say, that's the cops wiretapping my phone. It's the same thing here. If they're clumsy and they do a bad job of wiretapping your DNS, they will foul up your DNS, and that's what's going on here. The DNS man-in-the-middle attacker has a bad MX record on it, which is how you just get it. So he found, by doing 10,000 domain names, he got 139 broken responses. So there is somebody on the internet spying on people, intercepting traffic and spoofing it and fouling it up. And he managed to find their resolver address. You query a text record from this. This will tell you the public address of your resolver. So he was able to find something about where it was. Looks like the country is Finland for that one. But anyway, he did some probes, and here's the logic. You can do this for privacy protection. For example, you can want to conceal who's making requests, or you can be blocking traffic or redirecting traffic to the wrong place with DNS poisoning. So here's some countermeasures. If your local resolver uses TCP, it's harder to intercept. It has to have the handshake. You can use DNS crypt. That will encrypt traffic so that the man in the middle can't open it and modify it. You can send DNS over TLS, which I found out about this semester at the Cloudflare Summit, and I added it to your projects. That's a pretty brilliant solution. Send your DNS over HTTPS, so it's as secure as a secure transaction. And DNS Sec is another one. If you had DNS Sec enforced, then the man in the middle would not be able to forge the reply and have it accepted. Although we're nowhere near that working for end user devices yet, it would be useful to protect servers. So anyway, it's I've seen a lot of blogs like this, and it's good, clean fun where they discover some of the evil things going on the internet. There are lots of nasty things going on the internet. And when you send traffic to some page that you think is Google, there's a lot of things that can happen between here and there that mean you're not really talking to Google, you're talking to some kind of imitation of Google. And unless you use HTTPS, you really have no reason to believe that anything you see on the internet is real. And that's why the internet's pretty much switching to HTTPS all over. Anyway, all right. I thought that was a cute trick.